Alright, welcome everybody once again. In this video, we're going to be talking about our third topic with regard to elections, and that is how voters behave. We're going to talk about voters and the act of voting. Um, and yeah, so that is the subject of this video. Before we get to that stuff, however, let me show you my personal slide. My personal slide this time around is more pet content. I know you don't really want to know about me. You want more stuff about the pets because they're super cute. So here they are. On the left, we have my dog Ezra. Ezra loves soccer. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but nothing makes Ezra happier than chasing a soccer ball around the yard. You can see in this picture, he is smiling broadly. Um, Anybody who kicks a soccer ball for him, he will run and go get it and bring it back to you. The balls are a little deflated, so he can actually get his mouth around them and carry them places. Um, it's basically his version of fetch. He doesn't like sticks or bones. He likes balls, and his favorite is a soccer ball. So that's his favorite. And then over on the right, you see the two cats. That's Tyrion on the left and Shadow on the right. They mostly get along. You can see in the picture they're snuggling very cutely. The only real issue between the two of them is, as I've mentioned before, Tyrion is not quite 2 yet, and Shadow is going on, I think, 11 or 12. So Tyrion is a lot more energetic and playful than Shadow is, and sometimes Tyrion will try to play, and Shadow wants none of it. So he will hiss and spit and claw and do anything to get Tyrion away from him. That happens every now and again, but for the most part, as you can see, they are cute and cuddly and get along very nicely. All right, on to the serious stuff. So, voters have two decisions to make in any given election. Their major decisions are first, whether or not to vote, and second, who they should vote for. Whether or not they should vote relates to something that political scientists and political practitioners call voting turnout. That's just a phrase that refers to whether or not people vote. If you turn out to vote, that means you voted. And then who should they vote for? So in the first part of this presentation, we're going to talk about the factors that influence voting turnout. And in the second part, we're going to talk about the factors that influence how people decide who to vote for. Next slide. So this slide is a graph of voting turnout in the United States going all the way back to the founding of the Republic in the late 1700s. In this slide, the blue line represents presidential election turnout and the orange line represents midterm election turnout. And we're going to focus here on turnout from about 1950 onwards, because that's kind of considered the modern era in American politics. And one thing to notice in this slide is that turnout is pretty low. Turnout in presidential elections tends to hover between about 50 and 60%, never getting really below 50% and never getting much above 60%. It's pretty consistent in terms of where turnout in presidential elections is. And I should note, by the way, that this refers to general elections. This is not primary elections. So in presidential election years, between 50 and 60% of eligible voters vote. I should explain also, by the way, at the top, that title where it says United States VEP turnout rates. VEP stands for voting eligible population. So this graph just tells us what percentage of eligible voters actually voted. So what we are looking, in presidential elections, between about 50 and 60% of people vote. In midterm elections, and by midterm elections, we're talking about the elections which occur in between presidential elections, such as the 2018 elections. Those were midterm elections. In midterm elections, voting turnout hovers around 40%. Sometimes it's a little higher, sometimes it's a little lower. In 2018, it jumped all the way up to 50%. That is a record in the modern era. The record high had to do with high levels of voter interest owing to polarization around approval of President Trump. But for the most part, it tends to be between 40 and 50%. And between 1970 and 2016 or so, it was really very consistently at 40%. But the overall message to be gained here is that voting turnout in the United States is pretty low. So this is much lower than it is in other countries, and um, we're going to talk about why. Yeah, in other countries, voting turnout tends to be typically, depending on what country you're looking at, it tends to be somewhere around 70, 80, and in some countries even as high as 90%. Here, we're lucky to get 60%. So we're going to talk about why turnout tends to be low in the United States. So that's going to be in the next slide. The next question then is, what are the factors that influence turnout? And we can ask this question at the individual level and ask which voters are more likely to vote. And we can ask that at the collective level. What types of elections are likely to have a large number of people voting? So we're going to do each of those in turn. Individually, there are 4 factors that, more than any other, influence whether or not people vote. And that is a person's age, their level of education, their income, and something called efficacy, which I'll explain. But we'll go over each of those in turn. First of all, older people tend to vote more than younger people. This is something that has pretty much always been true for as long as we have studied voting. This is nothing inherent about today's generation. I'm not saying anything about millennials or Gen X or Gen Y or anything like that. Although Gen X, those folks are kind of older by now, but that's a different question. I'm Gen X and I'm old, whatever. But the fact is that young people tend not to vote. In typical elections, young people, and by that I mean the youngest age group that we study are the 18 to 24-year-olds. 18 to 24-year-olds in a typical election have about usually around 20% turnout. That means 20% of 18 to 24-year-olds vote. By contrast, in a typical election, among people who are 65 and older, 80% of them vote. So many, many more old people vote than young people. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but they all tend to boil down to the fact that old people have been around, and so they have more information at their disposal for them to navigate the challenges that I talked about a couple of slides ago. We talked about all the things that influence the cost of voting, and old people have learned how to navigate those things. Old people have, they know when they can vote, they know what the tools are available to them to make voting cost less. They also have a better idea of which candidates they like and which candidates they don't like. They have a lifetime's worth of information to draw upon. And so they are more able to solve the problems associated with the cost of voting than young people. It's also worth noting, this is less directly relevant, but it's still worth considering, the fact that older people receive more and more easily identifiable government benefits than young people. So older people, and I'm talking specifically about Social Security and Medicare, old people know what they're voting for. They're voting to keep Social Security and Medicare around, and they know that keeping up those benefits requires them to be active political participants, whereas young people have less solidified visions of what the government does and a less concrete idea of how their vote translates into government policy. So age is one of the key things that influences voting turnout. The second thing that influences voting turnout is education. people with higher levels of education are more likely to vote than people with lower levels of education. And again, for much the same reason, that education gives people the tools to overcome the challenges associated with voting, give people the tools to lower the cost of voting. They know this information, they know how to cast their vote, they know why it might be worth waiting in line. They know how to avoid those lines if at all possible. Um, and this is a type of information that we get when we participate in formal education. So people with more years of education are more likely to vote. Third, people with higher income are more likely to vote. And again, same story. Income helps people overcome those challenges that I talked about a couple slides ago. Income can make you less worried about taking an hour or two off work in order to go vote. Income maybe comes along with a job, which makes it easier to take that time off in the first place. Income can make it easier for you to hire a babysitter to watch your kids while you go vote. Income just makes it easier to solve many of life's problems, and the cost of voting is one of those. And finally is this factor called efficacy. Efficacy is not associated with the formal cost of voting like I've talked about before, but it has to do with those other personal factors. So efficacy refers to the quality of believing that your vote matters, believing that you can personally affect political outcomes and the conditions in your life. So someone with high political efficacy believes that what they do influences important things in their life. And people with low efficacy believe that nothing they do matters, nothing's going to change. As a result, people with high efficacy are people who believe that they have information to determine the difference between Democrats and Republicans, people who believe that voting is worthwhile, and people who have high efficacy tend to be people who vote. And people with low efficacy tend to be people who don't understand or don't believe that their vote matters, and so they tend to not vote. So the four factors that influence voting turnout on an individual level: people who are older, people who have more years of education, people who have a higher income, people who have high levels of efficacy, are more likely to vote. Moving on, we ask the question, which elections tend to have the highest turnout? What are the conditions under which a large number of people vote versus when a small number of people vote? Well, first of all, voting is higher when it's easier, when those problems associated with the high cost of voting are solved for the voter. So when there is easy early voting available, when polling places have extended hours, when there's vote by mail available, when there is easy absentee balloting available, when these accommodations are made, then voting turnout definitely goes up. So the way that the government treats voting turnout is certainly associated with levels of turnout. But even more importantly, voting turnout is higher when an election is really big and has a high profile, and that means there's a lot of media attention surrounding the election. Media attention is highest when there is a presidential election versus when it's a midterm or off-year election. I should note that I said midterm earlier and I put off-year here. Midterm and off-year mean the same thing. They both mean elections in which there's no presidential race happening. So when there's a presidential election, there's a lot of media attention, and so turnout is high. When there is an off-year election, there's less media attention, and so turnout is lower. People have less information, there's less interest, less knowledge about the election itself. Also, there's more media attention and general attention in a general election versus primary elections. So turnout is higher in general election versus primary. And I should note that this is related to a phenomenon known as ballot roll-off. I mentioned earlier the fact that more people vote in presidential elections than in other elections. And what happens is, even if everything is on the same ballot, if you have a presidential election at the top of the ballot, and then the next question is who should be your governor, then the next question is who should be your senator, and then House member, and then other officers down from there. Um, what tends to happen is people just vote in those top two or three offices. People will cast a vote for president, they might cast a vote for governor or senator, and then they'll leave the rest of the ballot blank. That phenomenon is known as ballot roll off. And what that means is, even in the same election, when people only have to go to the ballot box, go to their polling place one time, there still can be higher turnout for presidential elections because of ballot roll off, people voting in some elections but not others. That is a very common phenomenon. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to move to that next question of how do people decide who to vote for? And what's important to understand about how people decide who to vote for is that they're not very informed about politics. Most people don't really spend a lot of time paying attention to politics, and as a result, most people don't know a lot about politics. And I'm not casting any judgments here. I'm not saying that people are lazy or stupid or anything like that. In fact, I'm saying the complete opposite. What I'm saying is that the way people live their lives according to what they think is best naturally leads them to not paying a lot of attention to politics. And in a minute, I'll explain what I mean about that. But for now, let me just give a couple of examples. More than half the people in the country can't name a single senator from their home state. 40% of Americans can't name the vice president. 33% of Americans can't name the governor of their state. And this is just a few examples. Even more people can't name their House member or a member of their state legislature. I'm willing to guess that most of you listening to this also can't name your House member or your member of the state legislature or things along those lines. And once again, I'm not saying that this is because of any deficiency on your part. This is just the way things are. And the reason why this is the way things are has to do with the costs and benefits of learning political information. Learning political information has individual costs and only collective benefits. Here's what I mean by that. Whenever you spend some time learning about politics, however much time it is, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, that's time that you are spending. And we use that word spending quite literally. We spend time the same way that we spend money, like we talked about earlier. Any time you spend doing one thing is time you could have been spent doing something else. So if you spend an hour learning about politics, that's time that you're not spending learning what TV you might want to buy, or time you're not spending working at your job earning money, or time you're not spending with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or time you're not spending doing whatever else you might be doing. And this is important because learning political information might make us smarter, might make us feel more connected to the world that we're lived in, but it doesn't improve our lives in any material way. It doesn't make us richer or give us better relationships with our mothers necessarily, or although, I mean, if your mom is super interested in politics, maybe it does, but for the most part, it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily help us pass our classes. We learn about politics just, if we find, if we think it's interesting in and of itself, we might learn about politics, but it doesn't have a concrete benefit to us as individuals when we spend that time doing it. Like I said, we might do it because we think it's inherently interesting, but not, it doesn't have a material benefit for us. On the other hand, learning about politics does benefit the community. When we have a larger group of people who are informed about politics, that makes for more informed voting decisions. It makes for people who can choose which candidate is better for them more accurately. It makes for a citizenry that is better able to spot lies that politicians might tell. And so learning about politics may not benefit us as individuals, but it does benefit the community. The problem with that combination is that when something benefits an individual, but, or pardon me, let me rephrase. The problem is when something costs an individual something, but doesn't benefit that individual directly, people tend not to do it very much. Think about um, the way that we orient our behavior. This is a concept that I'm borrowing from the field of economics. There is something called a public good, and a public good is something that has individual costs but only collective benefits. And what happens with public goods, time and time and time again, almost inevitably, is that public goods tend to be produced at lower levels than society needs. Think about something like Social Security or welfare or public education or things along those lines. Those are all public goods. And for the most part, society has less of those things than it needs in order to benefit everybody at the optimal level. All of this is a long winded way of saying that political information is a public good, like those other examples. Political information costs people individually, but doesn't benefit them. And the result is that, or at least not materially. And so the result is that many people do not um, invest a lot of their time to gathering political information unless they're one of the few people who inherently finds it interesting, um, like I do, which is great for me. But I realize not everybody follows politics for the inherent interest. Um, so again, long-winded way of just emphasizing the point that not a lot of people um, are very informed about politics. Now, the flip side of that, moving on finally, is that you don't have to know a lot about politics in order to make a decision about who to vote for. Voting can be very simple. At the end of the day, especially when there's only two viable candidates, a Democrat and a Republican, all you need to know is which candidate you like best. Do you like the Democratic candidate or do you like the Republican candidate? And then pick the candidate. So the political world is complex, but voting can be very simple. That's the bottom line here. So the question is, how do voters overcome the complexity of the political world in order to make their relatively simple voting decision? And we'll talk about that in the next slide. Voters look for cues. They look for a simple piece of information that helps them decide how to make their vote choice. We use cues in all walks of life. Um, just as an example, if you're trying to decide what computer to buy, there are 1,000 different technical specifications about computers. And if you're like me, you don't understand any more than like 4 of them. Like generally, I know that faster processing is better than slower processing and more memory is better than less memory. But beyond that, I'm kind of clueless. So if I'm trying to decide how to buy a computer, I will try to find some way to figure out which computer is the best for me to buy. Now, a cue might be you like um, Macs better than PCs, or vice versa. Another cue might be you want to maximize processing speed, or another cue might be you want to get a computer that is good for gaming. There are a lot of different cues you might use, but most people, when they're buying a computer, figure out some cue and they follow that cue to lead them to the computer that they want to buy. They don't spend a gajillion years researching the technical specifications of all the different computers that they possibly could buy. I've put on the slide that a cue is also known as a heuristic. Those two terms are interchangeable. Heuristic is the more technical or fancy term for it. But getting back to the point, in the same way that we use cues to help us buy computers, people also use cues to help them decide who to vote for when they are voting in an election. And I have here a list of cues that people use, And by far the most important cue is party. And by most important, what I mean is the cue that most people use. Most voters, most of the time, decide who to vote for based on party. There are a lot of people who will only vote for the Democratic candidate. There are a lot of people who will only vote for the Republican candidate. And this, again, has been true for many, many years. This is nothing new. The importance of party as a voting cue has grown over the past few years as polarization has gotten stronger and stronger. But it grew from a place where it was already strong. So it's not like this is something that is new to today's politics. It's just a trend that's been gaining a little more steam as time has gone on. But the idea is that, once again, most voters, most of the time, are only going to vote for candidates of one party. And when I say most voters, most of the time, I really mean most voters. Um, this is something that is consistently at about usually 85 to 90%. 85 to 90% of voters will only vote for candidates of one party. There are a very small number of voters who are persuadable to vote for people of the other party. So party is really the strongest and most important voting cue, but it's certainly not the only one. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about these other cues. Single issue voting. Some people will pick one issue that they think is the most important, and they'll do this either consciously or subconsciously, and they will vote for whichever candidate is on their side in that particular issue. So it could be any issue. It could be gun rights or abortion or healthcare or taxes or business regulation or the environment or anything. And that issue is the one that's most important to them, and so they're going to vote for whatever candidate is on the right side of that issue. Another cue is the economy. Some people, if the economy is going well, they will reward the party in power, and typically this means the party of the presidency. So right now, the president is a Republican, so economic voters are going to vote for, if the economy is doing well, you vote for the party of the presidency, you would vote for a Republican and other Republican candidates. And if the economy is going poorly, you vote against the Republican Party, both in the presidential election and in other elections. So the economy is another cue. Some people vote based on how endorsements shake out. Either political actors, you look for who political actors who you trust endorse, or people follow the endorsements of celebrities, or people also follow the endorsements of their friends and family members. If you have friends and family members who are politically active and whose opinions you trust, people will follow those endorsements. And then finally, another type of cue that people use are demographic cues. Some people, and this is true especially of people in minority groups, will vote for candidates who share demographic traits with them. This is most commonly seen among women and members of minority racial groups. Some women will vote for the female candidate. Some members of minority racial groups will vote for members of their racial group. Also true of national origin, also true of religion, that people of different groups will vote for candidates that share those demographic traits. Okay, so that is it for voting and voters. And as always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to send them to me. Thank you very much. Turnout is low in the United States for a number of reasons, and we can pretty much group those reasons into logistical factors and personal factors. So I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. Logistical factors are the ones that influence the cost of voting. And by cost of voting, I don't mean how much it costs in terms of money. By cost of voting, I'm thinking about the term cost more broadly. What do you give up when you vote? And when you vote or when you do anything with your time, you give up, as I mentioned, time. You give up time, energy that you could have devoted to some other task. Anything anything you choose to do, whether it's watch TV, study, spend time with your friends, go to a movie, what have you, that is time you could have spent doing something else. So everything we do has a cost in terms of how much time and energy it takes. And voting is no exception. Voting has a cost, and that is associated with the amount of time and energy it takes to vote. So, what is it about voting that takes our time and energy? Um, Registering to vote takes time. For some of us, it may not take much time. For some of us, indeed, registration might happen automatically when we obtain a driver's license, but that is not true for everybody. So if you have to register to vote, that can take up some of our time, and indeed, not everybody is registered to vote. Finding your polling place can take time. Not everybody knows where to vote. Some of us can find this information relatively easily, but not everybody can. Not everybody knows where to look. And in fact, this is harder for some people than it is for others because polling places change. Whenever polling places get reshuffled or some polling places close, it takes time and effort to find out where your new polling place is. So, finding your polling place can be another um, element of the cost of voting. The third element of the cost of voting, and really the major element of the cost of voting, is the actual time that it takes to vote. And this is something that is unique to the United States because we are unusual in holding elections on a weekday. Most countries don't do this. In the United States, our elections happen typically on Tuesdays. This is something that is in the Constitution. And as a result, our elections happen when most people work. So people have to not only find the time to vote, but they have to work around their work schedules in order to vote. Now, this can be ameliorated a little bit. The blow of this can be softened through things like absentee ballots or early voting or things along those lines. But for anybody who wants to vote on election day, they have to find the time to do it. This also can impact not just work schedules, but childcare schedules. If you have a small child and you can't take you can't take your child with you to vote, that also adds to the cost of voting. Um, and as well, it should be noted that the time required to vote is very, very different from person to person and from neighborhood to neighborhood. In some neighborhoods, it's really easy to go vote. You just drive there, cast your ballot, and you walk away, and that's it. It takes 5-10 minutes. But in other neighborhoods, there are long lines that you have to wait in order to vote. We saw this just last week in the Wisconsin primary election, in which there were only 5 polling places for the entire city of Milwaukee, and people waited for 6 hours or more in order to vote. Now, that's unusual, but it is not unheard of. In the 2016 elections, there were neighborhoods in and around Atlanta where people had to wait multiple hours in order to cast their ballots. This is something that disproportionately happens in low income neighborhoods, and it disproportionately happens in minority neighborhoods, particularly African American neighborhoods. And so that is a cost of voting that is higher for some people than it is for others. Some people have to wait in line longer to vote than other people do, and it is a real cost. A fourth element of the cost of voting is something that is known as election fatigue. Election fatigue refers to the fact that in the United States, we have a lot of elections. We have presidential elections, we have midterm elections, we have state level elections, we have local elections. There might sometimes be a special elections to determine some local tax issue or a special election to elect somebody to replace somebody who resigned or retired. Elections happen all the time. Oh, and I should add that there are also primary and general elections for each one of the examples I just mentioned. In most places in the world, they vote once every 3 to 4 years. In the United States, we vote sometimes several times a year. And so people just can't keep up with it all. or they decide that it's not worth it to vote every time around, and that drives down turnout. Finally, ballot fatigue is related to election fatigue. Ballot fatigue refers to the fact that on our ballots, when we do go to vote, there are many, sometimes as many as 30 or 40 separate issues that a voter has to decide on. We elect a president, we elect a senator, we elect a House member, a governor, a mayor, a member of the upper house of the state legislature, a member of the lower house of the state legislature, city council, city officers, state officers. There can be up to 20 different officers. And in addition to those officers on the ballot, we also decide on ballot initiatives, substantive issues that voters themselves are supposed to research and decide upon before getting to the ballot box. As a result, there can be, like I said, 30 or 40 different things. And not everybody votes for all of them. Some people might vote for the president and the other top two or three things on the top of the ballot, but they don't vote for the other things that are lower down on the ballot, and that's because of ballot fatigue. They just don't have the mental energy to keep track of all the things that are on the ballot. And again, this is something that is unique to the United States. In most other countries, there might be a national question: which party do you want to represent you at the national level? Which party do you want to represent you at the local level? And maybe like two or three other things on the ballot. The United States is, as far as I know, the only one that asks voters to decide all of these things at the same time. So those are some of the logistical factors that add to the cost of voting. But in addition to those logistical factors, there are also personal factors that influence how each person feels about participating in politics. Some people are just not interested. They believe that politics just is not inherently interesting or worthwhile or worth their time, so they don't vote. Some people don't vote because they lack the information. They don't feel like they have a good basis for understanding what the difference between the candidates are, what the difference between the parties are, what the difference between um, a reputable news source and an irreputable news source is. And so they may want to vote but feel like they are unable to because they lack the information. Finally, some people feel like their vote just doesn't matter, either because they feel there's no difference between the two parties, or it doesn't matter what they do, nothing will ever change, or there are so many people voting that it doesn't matter how they vote, their vote's not going to decide the outcome. That for whatever reason they feel like their vote doesn't matter. So these are the personal factors that influence whether or not somebody is going to vote. So there are all sorts of reasons why turnout is low. And let's go to the next slide.